My name is Lauren Glendavidian, and I work with CCTV, and the panel that we are at right now, his name is burned in my mind. How does mainstream media reflect the ruling class? And so with that, I think I'll begin by having Michael speak.
Well, okay. I would begin by saying, should I stand up? Would that hurt the
That's
microphone?
fine. No, it's fine.
I would begin by saying that all human activity has a material base. That anything that happens can only happen because it has a material base. That is, the conditions of nature and human life are sustained in a certain way. Even the guru who sits there, the mystic who denies, whose life goal is to deny material existence, could not reach transcendence, could not reach mystical experience if there weren't somebody there filling his rice bowl, somebody there working the fields. The holy men of India will not touch the fields because as the plow goes through the ground, it kills little creatures and it would hurt life. So they leave that sort of thing to others, but they must have a material base just like anybody else. And the media too, which is consistently designed to let you forget about the material base of society, which does not talk about it at all, the media too has a material base. And in my investigation, I discovered that the news media in this country are not friendly toward corporate America. And they're not close to corporate America. They are corporate America. They are absolutely, when you look at CBS, you are looking at CBS Incorporated. It's a multinational corporation. It has on its board, it has interlocking. The directors on CBS also sit on Morgan Guaranty Trust. They sit on Exxon. They sit on General Electric, and so forth. And there's this whole network. You can go network by network, newspaper by newspaper, and you will find that these large concentrations of media production are owned and controlled by the same people who own and control agribusiness and oil and coal and steel, and most of all, the people who own and control all of those things, banking. That is the dominant capitalist mode in this country is not industrial capitalism, but finance capitalism. I don't want to document all that. I had some clippings. I can't get to them as I can't get to my luggage and all that because I can't find Will Miller and all my stuff is locked in his trunk. So, but I would have read you some names of corporations, and I think the effect would have been very effective as I ran down one after the other. But just imagine I just did that. Okay. ITT, Exxon, you know all this. Right, and you grow and you go, ooh, and so you know what that's all about. That pattern of ownership and control translates into control over what subjects will be covered and how, and there is a very definite bias. Now, not for a moment would I say that the media is absolutely controlled. You see, you don't have to have an absolute control. Certain things get in. They get in because editors don't realize the significance of a particular story. They get in because the media has a dual function. Don't forget, it's a specialized part of the ruling class. It not only must serve the few in terms of making money for them, that's number one, but two, it must serve the few ideologically, to maintain the world as they want to see it. But it also must market this highly processed, highly manufactured product called the news. Every day it tells you there's this thing that's been packaged, and it's the news, and that's what you should see today. And it has to market that to a mass public. And to do that, it must often deal with all sorts of things that bother the public, and also then bother the very people who own the news, who would much prefer them not to look into those things. Because the public wants to know, why must my son register for the draft? Why are they closing this factory in Greenfield and moving to Brazil? Why does everything cost so much? Why are my taxes so high? Why are there these toxic dumps where people are getting sick? And all these kinds of things come up to the extent that the media must give some attention to them, trivialize it, treat it as one little isolated muckraking case or whatever else. But to the extent they even do that, this causes annoyance among the very people who sometimes own them, and certainly among the ideological right. If it were up to the right, their newspaper would be nothing more than celebrations of the wonders of the private enterprise system, with a couple of anti-communist horror stories about how terrible life is in Romania and whatever else, and crossword puzzles and recipes and cartoons and all. And by the way, that what I just said, that description fits most of the newspapers in America. But we're talking about the mainstream quality press, which is a little better than that. So there are things that do get in. You can even use the mainstream, you can even use information from the mainstream media against the very ruling class that controls that mainstream media. But the overall picture is to never really go beyond certain parameters. Never really, by the way, never, for instance, never ever say anything positive about any existing socialist or revolutionary society. Never bring in question the idea that Nicaragua might have popular support among large sectors of its people, the Sandinistas might, for instance. Something like this. I think the case of China, Bernie gave a very good example in his talk today, which really talks to the heart of the media. You could see these events in China where maybe hundreds were killed, although I don't know, because that Tiananmen Square was absolutely the most saturated, media-saturated place, and I didn't see anybody dead. I didn't see the bodies and all that, and I heard very highly fabricated stories also, like tanks rolled over students who were asleep in their tents. Any student who would be asleep in his tent when 100,000 people were stampeding and shots were being fired and a whole army was moving in was close to death already. And that turns out to be apparently a fabricated story. But that story was kicked around for a long time. And Bernard made the point which is a point that media critics have often made, that the media will focus on an event and a happening, but not on a condition. And he said there's another condition of oppression. 45,000 people killed children die every day, but that's a condition, that's not news. I believe that's not news, not because it just happens every day and it's old hat, but because if you began to explore that, you would then begin to uncover all sorts of things about imperialism, which would uncover all sorts of things about capitalism. Sometimes the media will report that fact, but it will be treated as an isolated fact. It will report that there's poverty or that there's homelessness. You know, I read in the New York Times one week that there was 25,000 homeless people in New York that they counted. And there were 40,000 empty apartment units. Now, there's one of two things you can do with that. You can understand that there's a link between those two things. That the people who control housing are in housing to make money out of it, not to provide housing for people. And they will leave those units empty to get them off rent stabilization so they can then jack up the prices on them and make more money and drive people out and drive more people into homelessness. So that you can see the link between the plunder of the rich and the poor. That's one choice you have. The other choice you have is to go the rest of your life, through life, as a half-assed liberal and say, isn't that something? 25,000 homeless, 45,000 empty apartments. How foolish that is. What a silly way to do things. Why don't we do something about that, you see? And I maintain that the media invites you to do the second. They will tell you there's 25,000 homeless, but never say what are the social dynamics that have created those homeless. That's just only so far they will go. Now, when you talk to reporters about that and you say, why don't you talk about the social dynamics? They say, look, we're not going to get into your ideology. I said, what ideology? That's an empirical fact that these people did not drop down from Mars, that there must be something that created them. Why don't you go into that? And when you argue with reporters that they might be working for a system that's rigged, it's really very interesting. Some reporters know it, and they'll say, hey, we're censored all the time. You have to have very finely tuned antenna. There's just a certain line you can go. Some reporters, like Kevin Kelly, wouldn't work for them because he knows. So he goes and he works for a very fine writer, by the way, and he works for, you don't mind me saying, very small circulation publications. He works for those small publications that I write for also, right? And he writes for them too. But there are other reporters, most of them, the other 90%, I would say, don't know what the hell you're talking about. And I tell you, it is the most, since I've written that book, Inventing Reality, it's the most annoying thing to have to talk to reporters. I was giving a lecture at Duke, and after the lecture, I said, would you meet with a seminar of reporters? We have people from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Detroit Free Press, Time Magazine, and I forget what other, Wall Street Journal. I said, oh no, do I have to? I said, well, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And I had to sit with them. It's terrible, time and again. They sit there and they say, what are you talking about? I'm free to say what I like. And I say, because they like what you say. And then they say, the left could get its word in, maybe they don't work hard enough. I saw the labor reporter from the New York Times in New York sit with a whole room full of people from the labor press, from various unions who wrote for publication unions, and said, stop being crybabies. You got to get out there and try harder. We're not biased at the New York Times. And I said to him, you're not biased. the New York Times puts out a business section which has a staff of 45 people on the staff. And it has one labor reporter. And you don't see any bias just in that right there. And they don't see it. And they have a whole set of, we try hard, or we must be doing something right because the right criticizes us and the left criticizes us, so therefore, right, we do something right. Isn't that right? See, the left says that 2 plus 2 is 4. The right says that 2 plus 2 is 6. We say that 2 plus 2 is 5, so we must be right because we got them both on each side. They cancel each other out. And they have a whole bunch of these kinds of things. And so you begin to realize that the worst forms of oppression are those forms of oppression which so insinuate themselves into the fabric of your political culture and your everyday experience as to not even be experienced as oppression. I mean, these guys censor themselves all the time. They inject their political views in there and they don't even realize it, you see. And they don't even see the ways in which they are controlled. By the way, on the case of China, let me add another thing. Do you know during the weeks that China was receiving saturation coverage, and I don't want to take anything away from the courage and the commitment of the students and the legitimacy of their demands, which, by the way, you never even got in the press what their demands were. They had some interesting sets of demands. But I was feeling resentful. Not about the students. I was feeling resentful toward the media. As someone who for 30 years has sat down on pavements and been arrested and marched on picket lines and never received that kind of coverage, who for 30 years then runs home and sees a little, and today there was a demonstration, they went back, said, that was us, just before the ball game. You know, it really get resentful. And during those same 3 weeks, you know, 300 people were shot dead in Venezuela, in working class districts in Venezuela, over food riots. Not over something so abstract as democracy. And by the way, none of those kids in the square were starving, remember that. But these people were desperate for their homes, for their husbands, for their wives, for their children. They were out there and they were shot dead by the army in Venezuela. Okay, you don't give it saturation coverage. You don't give it all afternoon or whatever else, but maybe 2 minutes, a little something about what's happening in Venezuela, maybe something about what U.S. investments have done in Venezuela. No, that's asking too much, but at least something on it. So the media, you see, everybody's talking about China and want to pass resolutions on China. Sure, let's do it. And while we're at it, let's pass some for Venezuela and for Paraguay and Indonesia and East Timor and a whole bunch of other places that the media has consistently suppressed. And yet, even among the left, you see, the media may not tell us what to think, but they're telling us what to think about, and they're directing our attention toward a particular subject, and sometimes disproportionately so. I'm almost over, right? I'll finish up. The last thing I would say is, what they finally then say to you is, oh, what do you have, a conspiracy theory? Usually say with a crud-eating grin like that. Oh, what do you have, a conspiracy theory, Parenti? Like you've been demolished, and you're supposed to jump up on the chair and go, eek, a conspiracy. Oh, no, not a conspiracy. Oh, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Because there are no conspiracies, right? COINTELPRO, the Pentagon Papers, that never happened. The Watergate break-in, the Watergate cover-up, these were all conspiracies. Iran-Contra is a mind-boggling conspiracy. Members of Congress who are saying we may never get to the bottom of this and never get the whole truth of it. Certainly the way you're investigating it in your methods, you never will. Like not inviting George Bush, I thought was the biggest part of the cover-up. We may never, I mean, of course there are conspiracies going on, but in fact these elites do not operate conspiratorial only. They very much put it out front and try to legitimate their point of view and all that. But what they do is consistently suppress any awareness of the class interests that they have. And by class, I don't mean upper middle, lower middle. I don't mean a demographic stratification. I mean a relationship to wealth and power, which is the way Marxists use class. Those who own the land, the labor, the resources, the capital, the technology of this country and other countries, and those of us who are victimized by that pattern of exploitation and ownership. That's what we mean by class. And they do consistently and consciously cover that up and do not allow any discussion on it. And if you don't think so, go work for one of them and hand in some copy where you talk about that and see what the editor will say. You're getting a little overworked here on your story. This is getting a little ideological. Look, you should stick just to the facts. You know, you've just got to be factual. So there are indeed conspiracies. In fact, the ruling elites always talk about how they must work in conspiracy. Conspiracy means to collude together in secrecy for what are potentially illegal or immoral ends. And they do this all the time, and they talk about the necessity of it, and they even give it a name. They call it national security. Thank you very much.